It wasn't just a tax on whiskey. It was a battle for the soul of a young America.
Welcome to the Cigar and Whiskey Podcast, where every episode takes you deeper into the stories, traditions, and flavors that make cigars and spirits unforgettable. So pour a glass, light a stick, and settle in.
Imagine the Appalachian hills in the early 1790s. Western Pennsylvania was more wilderness than farmland, dotted with log cabins, dirt tracks, and families scratching out a living on rocky soil. Life was tough, money was scarce, and whiskey wasn't just something to drink at the end of the day. It was survival. Grain was bulky and hard to transport over mountain roads, but if you distilled it into whiskey, suddenly it was valuable, portable, and durable. Whiskey became the farmer's coin of the realm. A jug of rye could buy shoes for the children, settle debts with the local doctor, or be traded for tools. In that frontier economy, barrels of whiskey were as good as gold. But then came the federal excise tax of 1791, dreamed up by Alexander Hamilton. For Hamilton, the new tax on distilled spirits was about revenue and discipline. The federal government needed money to pay Revolutionary War debts, and Hamilton believed enforcing the law would prove the authority of the fledgling republic. For the frontier farmers, though, it felt like betrayal. Only a decade earlier, many had fought against Britain's unfair taxes. Now, their own government, the one they had bled for, was reaching into their pockets. The sparks came faster than anyone expected. At first, the anger was loud but not lethal. Farmers jeered tax collectors, ran them off with shouts, or ignored summonses. But soon, defiance turned violent. The flashpoint came at Bower Hill, the mansion of General John Neville, a wealthy landowner and tax inspector. In July 1794, hundreds of armed farmers marched on his estate. What began as a tense standoff ended in gunfire. Buildings were torched, and young Oliver Miller, a nephew of one of the rebels, was killed, the first casualty of the rebellion. Suddenly, this wasn't just about taxes. It was life and death. And yet, the rebels didn't see themselves as criminals. They carried liberty poles, waved flags, and shouted slogans that echoed the revolution. To them, they weren't lawbreakers. They were patriots, standing up against a distant government that had forgotten them. The mail riders carried more than letters. The rebellion didn't stop at Neville's doorstep. Soon, events spiraled into a broader crisis. One hot July day, rebels intercepted a federal mail carrier near Pittsburgh. Inside his bag, they found letters from local officials condemning the uprising. Outraged, they called for a massive gathering at Braddock's field, just outside the city. Nearly 7,000 men assembled, an army of farmers and frontiersmen bristling with muskets. Pittsburgh officials feared the town would be burned to the ground. In a desperate attempt to calm the crowd, the city expelled several of the letter writers and even sent out barrels of whiskey as a peace offering. This was more than a tax protest now. It was teetering on the edge of open insurrection. Even among the rebels, there was doubt. Not everyone in western Pennsylvania wanted bloodshed. Men like Albert Gallatin, a future Secretary of the Treasury, spoke against violence. Hugh Henry Brackenridge, a Pittsburgh writer and lawyer, warned that while the farmers' anger might be morally right, their actions were legally dangerous. These moderates tried to steer the rebellion toward negotiation, urging compromise instead of confrontation. But tempers were too hot, and distrust of the government too deep. The moderates' voices were often drowned out by the muskets of the angry. And this is where George Washington himself enters the story. The rebellion put President George Washington in an unprecedented position. No president had ever faced an armed insurrection at home. Washington knew he couldn't ignore it. If the government failed to enforce its own laws, the entire American experiment might collapse. So in August 1794, he issued a proclamation warning the rebels to disperse. His words were stern. Anyone defying the law was disturbers of the public peace. You can almost hear the weight of the revolution in his voice, a plea for unity, backed by the threat of force. But the farmers didn't back down. So Washington made history. He called out the militia. Nearly 13,000 troops from Pennsylvania, Virginia, Maryland, and New Jersey were summoned. the largest armed force assembled in North America since the Revolution. Washington himself rode out to review the troops, becoming the only sitting U.S. president ever to personally lead soldiers in the field. Imagine standing on a farm outside Pittsburgh, watching lines of soldiers march through the mountains, drums beating, banners flying. For the farmers, it must have felt like their own revolution had come full circle. Only this time, the army wasn't marching against a king. It was marching against them. When we return, we'll see how the rebellion ended, what became of its leaders, and how its spirit still lingers in every glass of bourbon today.
You're listening to the Cigar and Whiskey Podcast, your companion for cigar culture, whiskey wisdom, and everything in between. Want more? Visit us anytime at cigarandwhiskeyguide.com for articles, reviews, and pairing tips.
So what happened when the dust finally settled? When Washington's army finally reached the rebellious counties, the uprising crumbled. Leaders fled into the hills, rank-and-file farmers slipped back to their fields, and the great mustering of troops never turned into a pitched battle. A few men were arrested and brought east to stand trial. 2, John Mitchell and Philip Weigel, were convicted of treason. But Washington, ever mindful of the dangers of vengeance, pardoned them both. His point had been made. The federal government would enforce its laws, but it could also temper justice with mercy. Still, the scars ran deep. Many farmers felt abandoned, forgotten by the nation they'd helped to build. Some packed up and moved further west, beyond the government's reach. Others stayed and kept distilling, passing their skills and stubborn independence down through generations. And what does all this mean for us whiskey drinkers today? Out of the smoke of rebellion, whiskey became more than a drink. It became a symbol of defiance, survival, and identity. On the Kentucky frontier, farmers shifted from rye to corn, perfecting the recipe for what we now call bourbon. Aged in charred oak, bold and unapologetically American, bourbon carried forward the rebellious spirit of those Pennsylvania farmers. Even today, distillers and brands lean into that legacy. Labels speak of outlaws, pioneers, and independence. Whiskey lovers savor not just flavor but history, knowing that each sip carries echoes of a fight for dignity on the frontier. Think of Wild Turkey 101 with its raw, fiery kick. Maker's Mark Cask Strength, smooth yet powerful. Or Rittenhouse Rye, a Pennsylvania classic with spice and peppery bite. Each bottle has roots in that turbulent era. And paired with cigars like the Alec Bradley Black Market Esteli, the Arturo Fuente Hemingway, or the Oliva Serie 5 Melanio, the connection becomes tangible, rebellion in liquid and smoke. And if you want to see it for yourself, traces of the rebellion remain today. You can visit the Espy House in Bedford, Pennsylvania, where Washington stayed while leading the troops. Historical markers dot the countryside, from Bower Hill to Braddock's Field. Some distilleries in Pennsylvania and Kentucky proudly reference the rebellion in their branding, reminding visitors that the story of whiskey is inseparable from the story of America. The Whiskey Rebellion wasn't just a tax dispute. It was the first true test of American authority, a clash between ordinary farmers and the power of a new government. No great battle was fought, yet the outcome shaped the nation, proving that federal law carried weight, but also that mercy could temper justice. For whiskey lovers, the legacy is even richer. Those defiant farmers tied whiskey to the very idea of independence. Every pour of bourbon today carries a taste of their stubborn will, their fight for survival, and their refusal to be forgotten. So the next time you raise a glass, remember, you're not just drinking bourbon. You're raising a toast to the spirit of rebellion that helped define a nation. Thanks for listening to the Cigar and Whiskey Guide podcast. To read the full article and explore more stories that connect whiskey, cigars, and history, visit cigarandwhiskeyguide.com and subscribe on Substack so you never miss the next tale.
Thanks for listening to the Cigar and Whiskey podcast. Subscribe and share with a fellow aficionado and keep the journey going at cigarandwhiskeyguide.com, where every puff and pour has a story.